talking about pressure canning today, the basics of pressure canning. But what I want to do is I want to kind of divide it up a little bit. So if there's some sections that you don't want to listen to, especially the first sections, that's going to be about me and just a little bit about me and the history of canning. And so if you're not interested in those things, you can kind of skip ahead. So in the description, I will have it outlined at what's at certain sections. But I do recommend that you not skip when it gets into the more technical aspect of canning. There's some really important tips that are going to be talked about throughout. So about me. So what can I tell you about me? I'm just kidding. There is some things I actually find that I have a great life. Mother of two. I have two incredible daughters. And I am married to my high school sweetheart, who happens to be a lobster fisherman, lobster harvester, if you will. So, you know, keep your eyes open. Maybe I'll have some interesting things posted about lobster. I also work a full-time job as well. I live in Atlantic, Canada. I am Canadian, and I live in a small town on the east coast of New Brunswick. New Brunswick happens to be the only official bilingual province in the country. So French is my first language. So if ever you have any questions or comments and you're more comfortable in French, feel free to ask your questions in French. A word of warning, my French is an Acadian French, so I'm an Acadian French. So it's more like slang dialect. So we actually call it chiac, C-H-I-A-C. Well, I've been canning pretty much all my adult life. I do like maybe once in a while a batch of jam or a batch of jelly, probably not the right way. I actually got interested in canning more seriously after I attended a conference through work. At this conference there were workshops, and one of them happened to be on canning. And so since I already had a little bit of an interest in canning, I decided to attend this workshop with one of my work colleagues. And we absolutely loved it. The lady who was giving the session was a master food preserver. She was certified through a class that she had taken in the US. And so she was giving this course, it was a water bath canning course. And she was just so dynamic and passionate about canning and all things canning. And she just piqued my curiosity again to maybe get into it more seriously. At the end of the workshop, she actually talked about a session that they were giving. There were 3 master food preservers that were giving a session on food preservation. So it was everything about canning, dehydration, and fermentation. And I was instantly hooked. Like, I went to see her right away. I signed up, and I did take a 10-week class, about 3 to 4 hour classes, around 30 to 40 hours of class on food preservation, canning, dehydration, fermentation. So absolutely passionate about it now. I love it. So full disclosure, I am not a master food preserver. That is not recognized here in Canada. I am not an expert in any way. So please do your research. There's really good resources out there that I will talk to you about. It's where I look all the time. For safety reasons, I don't want to harm anybody with my food. Another reason why I got into canning is the convenience of having ready-made meals, quick meals to prepare. There's nothing better when you get home after a long day of work to just go into your pantry and grab a bottle of green beans, grab a bottle of stew, grab a bottle of meat, and within 5-10 minutes you have your whole meal prepared. So the convenience of home canning is incredible. Just a little history about canning, and you may be surprised to learn how long canning has actually been around. It was actually invented in 1809 by a French gentleman called Nicolas Appert, if I'm pronouncing his name correctly, from France. It was a request to the French government, who offered a generous 12,000 francs to somebody who could come up with a safe way to preserve foods for the soldiers in the army. So they needed large quantities of food to keep the soldiers safe and well fed and not too hungry. It took about 50 years later for Louis Pasteur to figure out how the concept of heating and sealing food actually kept the food safe from spoiling and going bad. So that's, in a nutshell, a little bit about the history of canning. There's lots to say about safety when it comes to food preservation. If not properly preserved, foods can develop potentially harmful molds, yeast, bacteria, and we don't want that in our foods. Some of these bacteria can be actually quite detrimental to your health. When we're talking about botulism, you're talking that it could actually be fatal. Botulism is actually a bacteria that creates spores, and these spores actually grow with heat, moisture, and lack of oxygen. So perfect environment when you're canning, because you have your heat, you have your lack of oxygen, and you have plenty of moisture. So this is why we need to heat our bottles, our low acid foods mostly, at a certain temperature to ensure to kill this botulism spore. It's the only way with low acid foods to ensure the safety of the food that you're preparing. A little note about sterilization. So you're going to see different things depending on what you read and where you read it. And should I be boiling my bottles or sterilizing my bottles before I use them? And when I took my class, they basically told us that you need to thoroughly wash and rinse your bottles. You can even pour some really hot water over them, like boiling water. The dishwasher is a perfect place to wash your bottles because it gets them really nice and clean, and I don't want to say sterile, but nice and sanitized. And most of your bottles are being processed for more than 10 minutes. If ever you're following a recipe, and I can't even think of something off the top of my head that you would process for less than 10 minutes, but if it's being processed for less than 10 minutes, then you should maybe boil your bottles. But what I do is, once they're thoroughly clean and washed in my dishwasher, is when I'm preparing either my pressure canner or my water bath canner, is I sit them in there as well. It also gives them a little extra clean. So do your research on what's recommended for sterilization, but you're going to read a lot of different things depending on where you look. Pressure canning is mostly done for your low acid foods. Your low acid foods are the foods that have a pH of more than 4.6. We're talking about like your vegetables, your soups, your sauces, your meats, your seafood. Those are all considered low acid foods and need to be pressure canned to ensure safety. Just a little side note on seafood. This may be a little bit disappointing. I do live in a fishing community where there's lots of lobster fishermen, but you cannot safely pressure can lobster. The only way to safely preserve lobster for an extended period of time is to freeze it. I know this is not what you want to hear. A lot of people pressure can lobster or water bath lobster, but it's not a safe way. There has not been a method found yet to safely can lobster. Talking from experience and being married to a lobster harvester, the best way to preserve lobster is by freezing it. Just put your lobster in a mason jar with a water and salt solution, and you freeze it that way. When you thaw it, it's going to be pretty close to being as good as fresh. There are some foods that are really not recommended to put in a bottle. There's no safe way to pressure can them. One of them is lobster, like I've already talked about. I just want to make sure you understood. You also have noodles or pasta, rice, flour, cream, milk, and thickening agents like cornstarch. However, there is a product out there that you can purchase. It's called a clear gel starch. So you can safely use this product if you want to make like a sauce or a gravy, or you want to thicken something. Another and very important point when it comes to canning that I can't emphasize enough is the importance of following a scientifically tested recipe. Certain recipes, like the green beans that I have, calls for salt, and that's one ingredient that you can omit from the recipe if you don't want to add any salt. It's not used as a preservation agent. When a recipe calls for vinegar, if it's not written on top of the bottle, the acidity of your vinegar, don't use it. It's going to be very specific in the recipe, the level of acidity that your vinegar needs to be. When it comes to the quantity of sugar for your jams and jellies, The sugar does act as a preservation agent, so you shouldn't modify the quantity of sugar in the recipe unless it is stated that you can modify that ingredient. Everybody has their favorite salsa recipe that they want to put into a bottle, and that is not recommended. You're going to hear lots of people saying, "Oh, I've done that for 50 years and I've never gotten sick." And when somebody says that to me, I kind of smile, and it's true, they haven't gotten sick, but then I'll say, "Not yet." During the class, they kept saying, repeating the same sentence, "When you know better, you do better." When I was a young child, a long time ago, we were in cars with no car seats and windows rolled up and our parents smoking in the front seat. We don't do that anymore. We don't leave our children in the back seat, not strapped in, and hopefully we don't smoke in the vehicle if children are there. So when you know better, you do better. And now you know better. Remember that you always need to start off with fresh, good quality foods. You shouldn't be canning foods that are starting to spoil, that are kind of going bad, that don't have a good appearance. The better the quality of the food that you can, the better the quality of the food that you're going to eat. When adding foods to your jars, there are two different processes you can use in preparing your vegetables or your fruit. So the recipe will talk about a raw pack or a hot pack. So a raw pack consists of taking your, let's say, vegetables uncooked, just washing them, prepping them, and putting them directly into the jar without cooking them at all. So that's considered raw pack. It's an acceptable method. It takes less time. There's less steps involved in the process. When you do the raw pack, what happens during the processing time is everything in the bottle tends to shrink a little bit, so you may have a little bit more space in your bottle than you intended. So when you do a hot pack, again, following the recipe, you're going to boil your vegetable or your fruit for a specific amount of time as indicated in the recipe. This will make your vegetables or your fruit more pliable, easier to get in the jars, and usually you can fit a little bit more in the jars. A lot of these recipes, both methods are acceptable whether you do the raw pack or the hot pack inside of your bottle. It's really important to know at what altitude that you live in. It has an effect on your pounds of pressure that you need for canning, and it has as well an effect on your processing times. So I know that where I am, I'm at 10 to 11 pounds of pressure, and the processing times that I need are the processing times when I'm looking at recipes in books, that the processing time indicated there is what I need. If you're living at higher altitudes than sea level, it's important to adjust based on your altitude. And how do you know at what altitude you live in? There's different resources that you can check out. In this book, the Bernardin and the So Easy to Preserve books, they have charts in there for altitude. The Bernardin goes all through Canada and the US. So there are resources there. As well, in Canada, you can check out your municipal agencies. A great online resource is a National Center for Food Preservation. It has a really comprehensive guide on all things canning, on recipes, altitude, processing times, so you can find a lot of really good information in there.
These are 3 books I got through the food preservation class that I took. The information and recipes are scientifically based, tested, and trusted recipes.
When it comes to equipment for pressure canning, you can spend lots of money if you want to. There are some things that are nice to have but are not necessary, and then there are some things that are kind of almost a necessity if you want to be able to pressure can properly. So we're just going to go through some of the basic equipment that you can purchase to help you along your processing, canning journey. The first thing I'm going to start with are the jars. So the jars come in different, it is recommended to use your basic mason jar bottles. These are considered wide mouth because you can see there's no shoulders to them like these. So these are considered wide mouth jars, and these are just considered your regular mason jar type jar. I kind of like the wide mouth when it comes to canning stuff like jams and jellies, just because you don't have that neck of the bottle when you're trying to get the last little bit of jam or jelly out of your bottle and you don't want to waste any. So I like these kinds of jars for that. These are nice when you're canning your vegetables or whatnot. It kind of stops them a little bit from floating too much to the top, and so it's just a matter of preference really of what kind of bottles, whether they're wide mouth or they're regular mouth jars. That's not important. Jars can be reused over and over and over again. The important thing to remember when you use your jars is just to make sure that you give them a good inspection, that there's no nicks and cracks or anything in it. You work so hard to process your food that you don't want a jar to break on you once it's in your pot processing. The recipes that you follow will always specify which size jars you can use and suggest different processing times. So make sure that you check out your recipes. So this is a 250 milliliter bottle, which is 1 cup, which is a half pint. So these two are 500 milliliter bottles, or 2 cup bottles, or pints. This size bottle is a 1 liter bottle. It has 4 cups. It holds 4 cups, or it's a quart. This size bottle is what I probably use more like for tomatoes and stuff when I want to can like large quantities of tomatoes. The cap system that I use and that's recommended is your 2-piece cap system. So where you have your cap that seals on top, and you have your screw ring or your screw cap that goes on the top of your lid. So when you're canning, you're going to put your lid and screw that on top, fingertip tight. These rings can be used over and over again. You wash them, dry them, reuse them, that's fine. It's not recommended to store your bottles with these caps left on. So once you've done your processing time, once you've left your bottles untouched for 24 hours, you have to remove these caps. These caps that seal, the ones that really do all the sealing, they're not recommended to be reused. I mean, you can keep them if you'd like, because if you use your mason jars for a million different uses like I do, where I put dried foods in it, or I store stuff in the fridge, or once you open your jar and you don't use everything that's in it, you can reuse it. For canning and for sealing purposes, it's always recommended to use new caps for your jars every time you seal. Even if your caps look like they're in good shape, you don't want to risk having 4, 5, 6 jars that haven't properly sealed, or having a jar unsealed 2, 3, 4 months down the road because you didn't use a new cap. These caps run here in Canada maybe for $3, $4 for 12 in a box. Let's look at some other equipment that you can get. This is a funnel, which is really neat to have. It helps to reduce the mess. I'm not going to say you will not make any mess, but it kind of helps reduce a little bit of the messes and spills, and they're really great because they fit on top of the bottles. So when you're adding your foods, your liquids, whatnot in your bottles, it really helps reduce the mess. It helps reduce the amount of food or anything that gets on the rims of your jar. So this is a really, I almost want to say, a necessity in the kitchen to have for canning. Your jar lifter, I want to say, is an absolute necessity. It's the only way to safely remove your jars from your pot because it fits really well. You grab them underneath the rim to lift your jars from the hot water inside your pots, so they work really well. So this, I want to say, is a necessity. This is a nice to have because it serves as a dual purpose. It's a magnetic wand. So when you are canning, and you fill your bottles with vegetables or fruits, it's recommended to take some sort of tool and to run it alongside. Once your bottle's completely filled, your liquids inside, just to run it along on the insides of your bottle to release any air bubbles that would have accumulated in your jar. And it's made of plastic. A lot of recipes that I've read have said take a spoon and run it inside. But the dangers with using a metallic spoon is that because they're more solid, you have more of a risk of chipping or damaging your bottle. The second end, which is a magnet, works really well because it's recommended to heat your sealing caps before you put them on your jars. So when you're getting your jars filled up, these should be sitting somewhere in nice hot water, not boiling. And then when it's time to put them on top of your jars, everything can stay nice and clean. So you're picking up your jars from your hot water with your magnetic wand and placing it on top of your bottle without touching the inside, without having to touch the sides. So it works really well. Also, things that I use, because this area here of my kitchen is my bottling station and I don't want to ruin my countertops. So I have like silicone mats that I use a lot for the hot items. I have cutting boards. So just your basic kitchen equipment. Another tip with your mason jars when you're canning is that sometimes they get kind of like a whitish film on your bottles. They're still good to use. Don't throw them out. It's just, especially if you have hard water. So you can always put a couple tablespoons of white vinegar in your canning pot before you start processing, and then that'll help keep the water stains from getting on your bottles. Here we have the star of the show, the infamous pressure canner. I have to tell you, I have to be honest, when I took the food preservation class, I swore I would never own a pressure canner. I was terrified of pressure canners. I went to the class, I figured, well, at least I'll be able to do water bath canning, but I will not own a pressure canner. Lo and behold, this is my pressure canner. So it took me going to a class, learning with a bunch of people to help me get over my fear of pressure canning. And one of the ladies was so great. She was like, listen, if you're still afraid of the pressure canner once you get home, just send me a message, call me up, text me. I will gladly go with you and do it with you at home. So she was just a sweetheart. I ended up doing it all on my own, quite proud. I did it on my own. Maybe a few messages to her here and there, but I have mastered the pressure canner and gotten over my fear. I no longer have a fear of the pressure canner. I have more of a respect now towards the pressure canner. Why do I have this one? This is the Presto 23 quart pressure canner. Now you have to be careful. This is not a pressure cooker, it's a pressure canner, and there is a huge difference. You cannot pressure can in a pressure cooker. Remember that. Your pressure cooker is made for cooking and not for canning. So if you own a pressure cooker at home and say, oh, well, great, I can can with it. No, you cannot. So that's why it's a little bit of a risk as well to say, well, I'll go buy myself a pressure something at a yard sale or at a thrift store, or because if you don't really know what it is, if it's a pressure canner or a pressure cooker, you could be putting yourself at risk. Is there a specific reason why I went with this particular brand? Not really. When I took that class, this is the model that everybody had, and it was simple to use, and that's what I wanted. So this is why I chose this brand. It has served me well for the years that I've had it, so I have no complaints. There's different models out there. Do your research, see what you're looking for. Some have a lot of knobs all around that you can to seal your pot shut. I find this one is really simple when it comes to sealing your pot. It's just a matter of lining up the arrows here and twisting it closed, and it's sealed. So I found it was a pretty simple concept. So this is why I really enjoy this pot. It's simple to use. Always refer to the instruction manual of your pot because things that I may be telling you for my pot, if you purchase a different one, could have very different instructions. So make sure that you keep it close by. The different parts of your pressure canner. You have this, most pressure canners have this, and it's called a vent. So this is where your steam is going to be coming out of when you're venting your pot. This is your pressure dial gauge, so it's going to tell you how high your pressure is. This little gadget here is kind of like a pressure regulator as well. I don't know if you can see it right here. There's another little black button that's like an overpressure button. So if the pressure would get really, really high inside the pot, this would also help to release some of the pressure. So these are the basics. So if you look at the inside of your cover, you also have a ring that is probably what is helping your pot seal very well. These rings need to be washed and rinsed well after each use. It's important that you inspect it and maintain it. If it starts to get old and dry and cracked, you can replace these. You can buy replacements for those rings inside your pot. An important thing to do before every time you use your pot, I always check to make sure that this little button can move because it's important. And I also look underneath up to the light so I can see through my vent. You don't want this vent to be blocked. I said before you cannot use your pressure cooker for pressure canning, but you can use a pressure canner for pressure cooking. If you do use your pressure canner for cooking, just make sure that your vent doesn't get clogged. It can get clogged with any kind of food particles or whatnot. My canner came with one rack. It is recommended to put your rack in the bottom of your pot so the jars are not on direct heat directly at the bottom of your pot. And I did purchase an extra one because when you're canning with these size jars or your pints and your half pints, you can stack them one on top of the other if you fill the entire row. But it is recommended to put a rack so there's not as much pressure on top. So I purchased a separate one. One rack is around, now remember all these are in Canadian money, so I want to say $20-25. The pot I think was around $150 when I purchased it. I'll link all that in the description below. My pressure canner when I purchased it came with this regulator. It's a one-piece regulator that fits on top of your vent. The problem with this regulator for the altitude that I live in is this is a regulator for 15 pounds of pressure. For the altitude that I live in, I'm at sea level, so when I'm canning, when I'm processing, I'm at 10 pounds of pressure. So I need to be processing at 10 to 11 pounds of pressure. So this one wouldn't have served a purpose for me. So what I did purchase, and this again maybe ran me around $20 to $25 for the regulator, is it's a three-piece regulator. So you have two rings that are this size, and then you have the main piece that looks like this that sits on top of your vent. So this piece alone is 5 pounds. I'm not quite sure if you would ever, if there's something that you would do at 5 pounds of pressure. But adding one ring adds on 10 pounds of pressure, and for me that's what I need. So, and if you live at a higher altitude where you do need 11, 12, 13, 14 pounds of pressure, you add the second ring on top of your regulator and then you're at 15 pounds of pressure, or you can just use the regulator that came with your pot if it's a 15-pound regulator. Can I put my pressure canner on an outdoor propane burner? And the answer to that is no. It's not a great heating source for canning. The temperatures can be unstable. It's difficult to control the flame outside with the wind, and so the best place to do your pressure canning is on your stovetop. I have a glass top stovetop. Make sure you check the instruction manual as well for your stove, just to make sure that it's okay to put heavy, because these pots get really heavy when they're full of bottle, when there's water in it, it can get really heavy. So just make sure that you check your oven's instruction manual to make sure that it's okay. And if you have a gas top, like a propane stove top, you are very lucky, because that is the most efficient way to do your canning, your pressure canning, your water bath canning. It works so well, so easy to regulate the temperatures. Everything seems to heat up a whole lot quicker. Once I put the water inside of my pressure canner, and it's not a lot of water, you can actually see in mine the water mark as to where I always fill my pot. It's kind of changed colors because of the water. I then turn the heat on, maybe like at a medium to medium high heat to start heating up the water in my pot. You don't want it to boil or to come to a really hard boil, but you want your water in there to be nice and hot. I have empty bottles in my canner so they're keeping warm. So I have my caps in a pot here, warm, hot. So these are the jars that I remove from the canner, I fill them, and then I replace them back inside. Always have your rack in the bottom of your pot. You've made your recipe, you've filled your bottles. Now these are bottles that I canned yesterday and it's been 24 hours, so I can move them around. But you have to remember, once you remove your finished bottles from your pot and you put them aside, you cannot touch them for 24 hours. Leave them alone, don't touch them. So these are bottles that were done yesterday. So when filling your bottles, refer to the recipe at all times, because the recipe is going to talk to you about make sure to leave an inch of headspace or leave a half of inch of a headspace. So if you're wondering what is headspace, so headspace is the space on the top of the bottle that you need to leave unfilled, if you want to say. So an inch of headspace on a bottle like this would be probably at the very beginning of the rim of your jar. So that would be about 1 inch headspace. Half an inch of headspace would be probably the line on top of that, closer to the top of your bottle. That would be about half an inch of headspace. Because the air will come out of your bottle, we want to remove the air and create a seal. So we need that headspace to be able to create a proper seal on your bottle. So make sure you follow the recipe. Every recipe can be a little bit different. So once you've filled your bottle with your low acid food that's going to go into your pressure canner, then you're going to fill it with the liquid that's recommended in your recipe, leaving the headspace recommended. You're going to wipe off the top of the rim of the bottle. Let me show you. If you're using vegetables, it's just with water. So you take a cloth and water and wipe the rim of your jar. If there's meat, you use vinegar. You want your water in there to be nice and hot. So once you've cleaned off the rim of your jar, you're going to take your magnetic wand, and I always have like a pot with the hot water here on my stove, keeping it warm. I'm going to pick up my cap, I'm going to center it on top of my jar. And you have to be careful because your jar is going to be really hot because it's a hot jar with hot liquid inside, so be careful. Once you have your cap on top of your bottle, you're going to take the second half of your lid and you're just going to twist it on fingertip tight, just like that, and that's it. Do not apply excessive force to close your bottle. It's not going to help the sealing process. Once your bottle is all ready to go, then you're going to take your bottle, your jar lifter, and you're going to place it in the bottom of your pot. And when I can fit nine jars in the bottom, so I can fill this pot with my second rack. I can have 18 bottles in my canner, so I find that's amazing. Once I have all my jars filled and inside my canner, so this is when the fun starts. So once again, inspect your cover, make sure everything's working properly. You have like this arrow and this arrow, so you need to, that's how you put the cover on, you align them, but then you have to properly close your pot. So all you need to do is slide this, like the two handles, one on top of the other, and your pot is now completely closed. So what I do at this point is I turn the heat up. You don't want to put it on your max, but you put it pretty high up. You make sure that your pot is centered on your element, and then your waiting starts. So what you're waiting for here is for you're going to see that everything's going to start warming up, and then you're going to hear that inside your pot things are starting to boil. So you can hear inside the pot it's starting to boil a little bit more, a little bit harder inside the pot. You can see little bubbles of water coming out of the vent. So you haven't placed your regulator. This still, don't touch this, this will be hot. But you haven't put your regulator on top of your pot yet. So it's just things heating up inside of your pot, boiling, and you're gonna hear that. I have water spews out of there, and sometimes water comes out of the vent. That's all normal. And this is what I have a hard time kind of explaining because I can't see it here in my kitchen. I don't know if it's the lighting or if it's the tile or what it is, but when you know your pot is ready to vent, and I'll explain what venting means, your pot will be ready to vent when you have a steady stream of steam coming out of your vent. It almost looks like a steam engine. So what I do to ensure that I have that nice steam is I put my hand, and be careful, don't burn yourself because it's hot steam. So I put my hand and see if I can really feel the pressure of the steam coming up on my hand. It can sometimes take anywhere between, depending on your stove, like 5 to 10 minutes, like depending on how hot your water was when you put your bottles in, to get to that point. Sometimes for me, this button will even pop up. So what's going on when this is happening? So we've filled it with our jars, we've got this boiling, we're getting a steady stream up here. This is what we call venting the pot. Just emptying the pot of all the air. So you only start timing your 10 minutes when you have that steam engine-like steam coming out of your pot. So you time for 10 minutes, and this is venting. Once you've vented your pot for 10 minutes, you're going to place the pressure regulator on the vent pipe. And you will see within a few seconds of putting that on, if it hasn't already happened, this little button should pop up. The pressure is going to begin to increase, and you'll notice that the pointer on the pressure gauge is going to slowly start to move up, indicating the pressure that's going to be inside your pot. So you continue to heat, closely monitoring so you do not build excessive pressure. Start to slowly decrease the heat on your stove burner when you're 1 to 2 pounds below the desired pressure. It will still continue to increase. When the desired pressure is reached, continue adjusting heat on the stove to maintain correct pressure. If the pressure is too high, slowly decrease the heat. Don't decrease the heat too quickly because then it can cause your pressure to drop below what you need it to be. But if this does happen, increase the heat once again and start timing again from the beginning. You only start to time the processing when your dial has reached the desired pressure inside your pot for your region. So the time is up. Your jars have processed for the appropriate amount of time. So the next step that you need to do is to turn the heat off on your stove. So you turn that off. And now you have to be kind of careful because you have two options. You can either leave the pot where it is if you feel that it could be too heavy for you to move, or you can move it to a different section of your stove and it'll probably cool a little bit faster. Don't slide it across your stove top because you're going to ruin the top of your stove. I know my pots I can lift, or I've done it before, so I know that I can safely lift my pot. So the way to go about it, remember everything is still really hot. So you're going to take your pot holders and hang on to your handles and just lift straight up, move across, and then gently place it down onto the cool part of your stove. What's going to happen now is that the dial is going to slowly go down. So the pressure in your pot is slowly decreasing. I've never timed it, so I'm not quite sure exactly how long approximately this can take. So I just kind of leave it. This is the one part where you can actually leave your pot alone and forget about it. So the pressure is going to go down to 0. And then eventually this button is going to drop. And now, like I say, if your pressure canner doesn't have this button on it, read the instructions on your manual. Once this is at 0 and this button is dropped, then you can safely remove your regulator. Don't remove it before, only when all that has happened. You remove your regulator, and be careful because it's still going to be, the regulator is going to be hot. And then you time this again for another 10 minutes. Once your 10 minutes is up, this is when you can finally, safely remove the cover of your pot. Please don't try to do it before. Trying to force the pressure out of the pot can cause different things to happen. First, it can be really dangerous. If you try to force depressurization, it can cause siphoning, it can cause liquid to come out of your bottle, and you don't want that to happen. Just let things cool off progressively or slowly. Once that 10 minutes is up, you can safely remove your cover. So you're going to twist to open on this pot, on this model. So I just twist it open. And you want to lift the cover away. Don't lift it towards you, lift it away, because there's still a lot of heat and steam inside your pot and you don't want to burn yourself. So you lift your cover away from your face with pot holders and just put it aside somewhere. Once you've removed your cover, you need to leave your jars in your pot again for another 10 minutes. Once that 10 minutes is up, then you can safely remove your jars from your pot. When removing your jars from your pot, you really need a jar lifter or something, because it's really, really hot. You're going to see that the liquid inside of your bottles is even still boiling, and that can go on for quite a while. And you may start to hear as well your bottles sealing. It has a distinctive popping sound to it. So listen for those pops. That's indicating that your jars are actually sealing. So to remove your bottles, you can't move your bottles in all kinds of directions. Picture your arm like a crane. That's what they keep telling us in class. Your arm is a crane. So you just grab underneath the rim of the bottle and lift straight up, move across, and set it down. Remember, where you set your bottles down is where they need to stay for 24 hours. Don't touch your bottles for 24 hours. Don't touch the top of them to see if they've sealed. You really got to leave them alone for 24 hours. Like I said before, 24 hours have gone, your bottles were untouched. So now you want to check the seals of your bottle. So how do you know if your bottle has sealed? Well, there's a couple ways. You're going to start by removing the rings. You don't store your bottle with the rings. Put them aside, wash them, and use them for your next job. You're going to know your bottles have sealed. If I touch the top of the bottle, I shouldn't feel a lump on top of the bottle. It's kind of concave. I should not be able to press down on the top of the bottle if it's sealed. If you hear that noise, that means your bottle probably didn't seal properly. Now, what do you do if your bottle hasn't sealed? It depends. If I'd have an entire batch that hadn't sealed, or half a batch that didn't seal for whatever reason, I maybe would reprocess them. So you go through the entire process all over again. You replace your sealing caps, put new caps on because they didn't seal the first time, and you reprocess them again from the start. If I just have one bottle that doesn't seal in a batch, usually I'll just throw a cover on it and put it in the fridge and eat it within the next 2 to 3 days. I wouldn't go to the trouble of reprocessing just one bottle. One final tip, please remember there's lots of information out there online, everywhere on canning. Some of it's excellent, some of them not so great. So just be careful and make sure that you look in reputable sites, read reputable books, just to ensure that you stay safe and the food that you eat is safe and in good quality. So I hope you really enjoyed this vlog on pressure canning, and I hope it helps you along your journey to food preservation. I hope I have lowered your fears of pressure canning a little bit if you were like me and afraid of them at the first. If you like the content, if you'd like to see more, if you have any suggestions at all on what type of content you'd like to see, things you'd like to preserve, leave me a comment. I'll see what I can do. I'll see if I can find it. I'll see if I can can it. And we'll talk again soon.